All right, we are live. We'll just give people 30 seconds to join in here, and then we'll get started. All right, let's kick off. So welcome everyone, and thanks for joining this fireside chat today. So I'm Mikkel from SYNQ, and I'll be guiding our conversation today. And we're joined here by Petr, the founder of SYNQ, and Toby, the co-founder and CTO of TobyGo. And the topic of today is the recent integration and partnership between SYNQ and SQLMesh and how that shapes different data workflows. Just before we dig in, a little bit of housekeeping. So on the right side, you should see a chat. And if you put in a question there, we'll make sure to bring it up so Petr and Toby can see it and get to it. So to kick things off, let's start with an introduction. So Petr and Toby, if you could just talk a little bit about your background and what led you to start SYNQ and TobyGo.
Okay, let me start. So, hi, my name is Petr. I'm an engineer by background, and at this point, it's about 20 years or so I spent building software. And out of that, about last 10 years, I spent leading technology companies, especially building data-intensive applications. And so I had the privilege to see a lot of engineering teams working alongside of data teams. And if I go back 3 years ago, I still had a feeling that we had a lot better tooling in the engineering world, particularly for observability, which was the reason why I realized that there's a company to be built in a data space and started SYNQ. Toby?
Cool. So yeah, I'm Toby. I'm the CTO and co-founder, one of the co-founders of Typical Data. So prior to starting the company, I worked all over, but more recently, I was at Netflix for a couple of years where I led the experimentation team, making out experimentation and metrics platforms. And then after that, I joined Airbnb where I led the analytics org, working on experimentation as well as Minerva, the metrics framework. And so while I was there, I thought that perhaps I should start a semantics layer company. But, as I thought about it more and saw kind of the landscape of semantics layers, I realized that the true value of Minerva, at least at Airbnb, was in transformation, right? Of course, semantics are important, but it's very difficult to first get good data to good metrics. And so decided at that time that there was an opportunity to kind of take what I've learned at operating at massive scale to build out a modern SQL transformation framework that could work at any company.
Very cool. Yeah, that's super relevant experience. I also read a lot of that myself about the early material. So diving in at the topic of today's chat, the integration, could you give a bit of a background of how this integration came to be and why it matters in the first place?
You want to take that, Peter, or should I?
I can start. So I mean, for us, our philosophy of building integrations in SYNQ is relatively simple. We drive everything from customer demand. So from our perspective, actually, this came from our prospects and customers where we started to see actually quite a lot of increase in interest in SQLMesh in community. And especially when we bumped into a shared customer where we found a pretty large enterprise company who already adopted SQLMesh. For us, it was kind of natural trigger point to integrate. I've been following SQLMesh for quite some time, so I've been kind of waiting for the moment when we meet in the field. And so from our perspective, we came to already deployed SQLMesh, and our role was to enhance this ecosystem with observability, especially going beyond SQLMesh itself. So definitely from our perspective, it felt very natural to make the move, and we joined forces and essentially plugged SYNQ into SQLMesh alongside other platforms which we already integrate.
Very cool. Anything to add from your side, Toby?
That makes a lot of sense, So SQLMesh and Typical Cloud really focused on making the experience of kind of a SQLMesh project great, but there's a lot of other data assets, right? And transformations that happen outside of SQLMesh that need to kind of be cohesively observed, which is why I think SYNQ is a great platform to do that.
That makes sense. And I think many here in the audience might be familiar with different types of DataOps tools and different types of data observability tools. But just to make the distinction a little bit more simple, I'm going to bring up this diagram here, and it's really interesting to talk a bit about more in detail. Why does it make sense to integrate these different tools, and where is there overlap, but also where is there things that kind of complement each tool?
Yeah, so I think that there's a little bit of overlap, of course. Tipico Cloud has its own observability, but the observability for Tipico Cloud is really around kind of deep understanding of SQLMesh, how that's operating, and the operational health within SQLMesh, right? And so for things outside of that scope, right? For example, downstream assets or upstream assets of SQLMesh, it makes sense to have a more general overview and observability platform like SYNQ to manage that. I think one of the kind of interesting or kind of unique partnerships that we have, or similar kind of levels of abstraction, is that I think Tipico and SYNQ both operate kind of on a model level. So not necessarily on actual tables, which I think a lot of other kind of platforms really only focus on, but having the abstraction of a model, which represents like business logic and some entity that people interact with, is something that we both kind of encapsulate.
Yeah, definitely. I would add to that where we see kind of the additional value. Of course, there is this ability to stretch visibility beyond SQLMesh and then almost like even help understand if there is this model failing in SQLMesh, what does it mean for my business? And from our perspective, we particularly actually focus on even the layer above that. So of course, observability is part of SYNQ, but for us, the key comes even beyond that, where we work with the businesses who are defining data products and defining almost like, this is my very critical data asset I have in the business, which is powering some critical process, and then giving them the entire workflow around it, how to activate their owners and send relevant alerting, do the incident management and that whole process. So this is how I even see it being used in practice, where we see SQLMesh models being turned or grouped into products in SYNQ, which are then exposed to closer to the business, and that almost like brings that synergy to life, where we kind of see the connection. And to your point, Toby, in terms of the kind of centricity around models, I think there was, at least for me, it was almost like a lucky discovery where we did the integration, where I realized how nicely compatible actually the platforms were. Where for me, the realization that your tables are moving basically all across the warehouse as the snapshots evolve was kind of tricky challenge to overcome from observability perspective, because most of the solutions focus on tables would basically disconnect the time series and have to start over. So then I think we realized that some of our solutions, which are anchored in models, were super helpful to actually do that integration very quickly. And that's where we kind of felt like it actually stuck together very nicely. Yeah.
Could you give me just that 1 minute primer on this idea of model to people who are not familiar with that concept?
Sure. I mean, a model is basically a representation of some business logic, right? And so, for example, the end goal for any data product, right, is to make decisions, right? But you can't just make decisions on a table, right? You have to kind of manipulate that into something that makes business sense, right? There's usually maybe some joins or some things, right? And so you can represent that within a model, right? So a model is basically a collection of SQL queries that can produce a table, right? But throughout time, your business changes, and so does your model, right? And so a model basically allows you to change your business logic, and it will automatically then create assets which you can use downstream in reporting, etc. Right? So a model is really just the encapsulation of business logic that represents an output, which is usually in the form of a table.
Yeah, that makes tons of sense. I want to move on as well to talk a bit more about the details and the workflows that end users can experience when they combine SQLMesh with SYNQ. So if we try to make this practical, are there specific examples of how data practitioners can experience benefit of this integration and some kind of key day-to-day workflows they might have?
I can maybe start with a few which I've observed. So for me, like one of them is bringing a holistic overview of quality. So of course, SQLMesh has its own concepts like audits, where SYNQ has concepts like anomaly monitoring, but also maybe you're running Airflow jobs, which are, let's say, leading to in the pipelines towards the execution of SQLMesh. So from our perspective, where we mainly focus is to help bring the unified overview, where I can open a single place and see, is everything working, yes or no? And if something's not working, where through that ecosystem is the impact. So if the Airflow job fails, it might mean that number of SQLMesh models might not run, the number of data products and dashboards might be impacted. So for us, it's definitely focused on that holistic observability. And the second workflow, which I think is very powerful, is the concept of anchoring use cases in the business to data products, and then anchoring data products to SQLMesh models, which then kind of connects the dots between the models which are representing the business logic and creating these assets for decision making, and then actually tying it very clearly and specifically with the use case in a company. And again, the understanding that if things break or change, where is the impact and where are the critical things, especially in business.
Right. And so once you use SYNQ to kind of figure out, when things happen and go wrong, you can then take those learnings and then basically put them into SQLMesh to make sure that you can catch these things ahead, for example, at compile time, et cetera, right? So for example, if you, with SYNQ discover certain anomalies of things you should expect, or perhaps things related to bad code or deployments, right? SQLMesh, gives you the tools to do that. For example, creating unit tests, right, which ensures that perhaps like a user change won't be made again. Additionally, with our snapshotting and observability and deployments, right, you can see exactly when kind of these anomalies might have been introduced, right, and so you can easily roll back, or if you want to move forward, you can make changes and then kind of at compile time see exactly what's going to be impacted to kind of make recovery and moving forward faster.
That makes a lot of sense. And I also want to touch on one of the points you mentioned that in the beginning, Toby, was that when you decided on building kind of a DataOps tool instead of a semantic layer, you were very well aware that a lot of work would happen within that space. And I think that's something we hear again and again as a big challenge, that data practitioners have to do a lot of stuff in a lot of different tools. And one thing we've seen be really powerful is this idea that you can actually manage a lot of the SYNQ deployments all the way from monitors to ownership through SQLMesh metadata and model properties. So if we just quickly discussing this idea of setting up and managing things through code and then bringing that back into SYNQ.
Yeah, exactly. I think that the people who kind of write the business logic are usually also the ones who need to maintain the code. And so having in deployment of the code. And so having all of that done in kind of one unified place, exposing the metadata and then having the DataOps trigger so that we can interact with other tools, right, is a very powerful workflow, especially, if it's in one place and it's all source controlled. Having to go to multiple different tools to configure things, it's a lot more painful to manage. When things do go wrong, you don't know exactly what's going on. And so making sure that SQLMesh has the right metadata and the right ability to do triggers and arbitrary execution of and interactions was important to us when we built our product, to make sure that it can really provide a unified experience for proper data ops.
I guess I would definitely complement that from our perspective, where actually the philosophy behind SYNQ is to be the least likely to be a source of information. What we actually want to do is work with the metadata from the underlying platforms and create the workflows on top of them. So in that sense, when our customers come and ask how should they configure specific things, should they use our API, my first reaction is, well, have you considered pushing it down to the metadata in the SQLMesh and the actual models themselves, because that's very kind of cohesive unit of information. And again, we can then activate it into various workflows from sending alerts and triaging issues, etc. So definitely, I think the metadata is the almost like the key glue between the systems in that way.
Do you have a rule of thumb of when it can be a good idea to think about things as being defined in metadata versus when it makes sense to do it in the UI?
Well, in general, when things can be done in the metadata, I think it's nice because then it's all in one place and it's source controlled. You can easily roll back. But of course, for things that can only be done in the UI, maybe that's a good place. But also, it really depends on the user, right? Because there might be controls or things that are done by people who don't use SQLMesh or use something else, right? Or they might not have they don't want to, or they don't have the technical nuance to look at the code. And so for those, a UI experience could be better, right? And so I think some of it depends on the personnel making those changes. But in general, having one source of truth is usually more maintainable.
Yeah, definitely. I see like a spectrum of this among teams. I think some are very religious of saying everything has to be in the code and we want to push it down to the models. Where I typically see more focus on UI is exactly the less technical users. There are teams we work with who don't have access to the code base or don't feel even comfortable doing that. So I think there is opportunity for UI workflows to also abstract some of the details when you might create a specific type of a test by clicking a button at test of a specific type to check for a format of date of birth, and you don't have to figure out what's the right regular expression. You have to put it into code, etc. So I think there I would do the distinction, but if it's engineering or analytics engineering, data engineering audience, I would say why not do it in the code as a default.
Yeah. A core pillar of both platforms is also testing and monitoring. And I think we've come to use this term known unknowns and unknown unknowns as ways of thinking about types of tests. And often we say tools like SQLMesh is really good for known unknowns and anomaly monitoring, and tools like SYNQ is really good for unknown unknowns. Could you talk a bit about how these different types of tests, they complement each other, and what they even are in the first place for people who might not be familiar?
Yeah, maybe I can start here. Is that I guess like actually how I think about testing is through the concept of the life cycle of the software, right? Because eventually the models are software, which is code, which is creating some data and essentially is maturing from some idea to a production system. And so like taking the roles from or the principles from traditional engineering, the testing and reliability is actually built throughout the entire journey. So from the minute I have the idea towards the minute when everything is running in production. And so to me, the practitioners need a tooling which helps them do the right level of testing throughout the entire journey. And this is where I definitely see SQLMesh being way closer to the development, that there is, of course, types of tests and concepts, and maybe I'll let Toby explain the details, where we go from unit testing to data testing, and we're really verifying the data before it hits the production, and we try to eliminate as much as possible. But to the point of unknown unknowns, actually, what I see is a lot of customers who might do actually really good job with the testing in their platform, but there are still types of issues which make it through. And to give you an example, there's a lot of companies we work with who ingest data from a third parties. And so their models actually might work perfectly, be well tested, but their partner doesn't send them data, or the issue happens outside of their control. And so that's where I see, and that's the same in any software system which is running with the sufficient criticality, that there is a level of monitoring which happens post-deployment when things are running in production, and we're basically catching all these unexpected issues, such as, oh, this customer or this provider of data changed date of birth format, and now it's completely messing up our models, or the data doesn't arrive at all, or it's delayed, or half of it arrives. So I see it very much as observability is not focused on post-deployment and detecting issues which might happen in production system, whilst the development platforms are of course trying to prevent the issues actually entering production. And I think these things complement each other very well.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary.
Cool. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You also mentioned we had this shared enterprise customer in the beginning, and I wonder if there's anything you can share around how the integration is already being used, and maybe you could also touch upon this notion of data products that we heard a few times, and if there's specific examples or ways of thinking a bit more practically about data products as a concept.
Yeah, you can take this, Peter.
Yeah, definitely. It's a very loaded term, so I'll give my take and see where that takes us. So, so from the perspective of maybe like first of our thinking about it from SYNQ side, for us, data product is typically a data output which serves some role, some critical role in the company. And so when we started working with our shared customers, the main focus was to almost like help them codify these critical data systems into observability and then monitor them. In the case of the integration we've done together, actually, because it's an enterprise company, they actually deploy multiple projects of SQLMesh, multiple data sets in Snowflake. So they have quite a few almost like segregated parts of data platform where data flows from the early stages where data might be collected from different partners through processing to essentially form a data marts, which are essentially tailored towards the use case. And SQLMesh is deployed through each of these phases. And so where we see the synergies that in the case of this customer, they defined the stages to be a data product. So essentially, we can then see that if the input data product fails, there is a impact on the somewhere downstream on perhaps the data marts, which have the critical role in business. So in that sense, we basically saw again like this good synergy where in this case the entire SQLMesh projects were exposed and wrapped into the concept of data products, and almost like it was seen as an interface of handover of data between different parts of the company. I would definitely describe it as almost like a not SQLMesh, data mesh implementation, right? Where you have these kind of areas in the business which are handing over data from one team to another, and essentially, at least from what I've seen, is that the SQLMesh project was kind of the unit of operation inside of the business, and that was tied to the data products.
Yeah, very cool.
And don't know if I maybe Toby, if you have anything to add here.
Cool. So I guess last question, looking ahead, what's next for SYNQ and Toby and also for the partnership? Is there anything interesting that people in the audience who cares about both tools and both tools coming together that they should know about?
Yeah, I think one interesting opportunity that we can work together on more is we're really focused on expanding out kind of the type of kind of observability metrics we're producing, right? And so, for SYNQ to consume and operate on more of those metrics to power more insights for a knowledge detection or other use cases, I think would be great. Additionally, this quarter we're really focused on things to do with data privacy and data security and roles, right? Role-based access control. And so integrating those kind of things with SYNQ, I think could have a lot of potential in terms of kind of unifying that whole experience and making the whole kind of integration with observability and data security and roles more robust.
Yeah, maybe, and from my perspective, the strategy behind SYNQ was from the beginning to focus on the analytics engineering audience at the core. So for us, it almost comes with the commitment that any new concepts which are introduced within SQLMesh, we want to kind of follow and natively represent in SYNQ. So the customer who is using the SYNQ as a platform to observe SQLMesh has full visibility of all the concepts which exist from the kind of source tables to the models and anything what comes. So from my side, it's definitely this kind of desire not to stay close to just tables, but actually really fully observe things on this kind of semantic layer whenever it's the models, metrics, or data products. That's really where we see that. So definitely excited to see what the future of the kind of progress of SQLMesh, and also was like gradually integrating all these new concepts as well. I'll also take a note on the roles management. It feels like a good conversation we should have as well.
Yeah, sounds good.
I also believe there's an event, the group buy event by Toby in March, 20th of March in San Francisco. Maybe you could add a note to that, Toby.
Yeah, so we're planning to have kind of our first conference. It's going to be in San Francisco in March, and yeah, we're going to have some speakers. It's going to be a relatively small event because it's our first year. But if you're interested, let us know. And yeah, we'd love to kind of meet all of you and kind of share what's kind of up and coming with Tobico and in the ecosystem to kind of expand on this new postmodern data transformation.
Very cool. Yeah, we're also excited about it. So we're gonna head over there and join you folks and maybe get to chat to some people who are interested in both SYNQ and Tobico and SQLMesh.
Fantastic.
That's it. Thanks everybody for joining. And if you want to know more, there's a blog post on both the Tobico blog and on the SYNQ blog, going a bit more into detail about the partnership, some of the stuff we can do, and some of the workflows. Cool. Thanks, Petr. Thanks, Toby.
Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. Thanks, Toby.